The morning Augusta Shepard arrived in Dry Creek, Texas. The sky was the color of a bruise healing at its edges, and the town looked at her like she was either a miracle or a mistake. It was the spring of 1882, and Augusta had traveled 3 days by stagecoach from San Antonio, arriving with 2 trunks, a crate of books, a letter of appointment from the Dry Creek Town Council, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her worst quality and her father had always called her finest. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a conviction that education could change the world, or at least this one dusty corner of it. Dry Creek was a cattle town that had seen better days and worse ones in equal measure. The main street was a rutted stretch of hard-packed earth lined with a general store, a livery, a post office not much larger than a wardrobe, a saloon with a broken shutter that banged in the wind, and a church whose minister had ridden out 6 months prior and never come back. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, slightly apart from everything else, as if the town itself was not entirely sure it wanted the building, but had built it nonetheless because a visiting circuit judge had told the mayor it was time. Augusta stood in front of that schoolhouse for a long moment before she went inside. It was a single room with 12 rough wooden desks, a potbelly stove in the corner, a blackboard that had seen better decades, and windows so dusty the light came through them looking apologetic. But to Augusta, it was exactly what it was supposed to be, a starting place. She spent the first 3 days scrubbing the floor, cleaning the windows until they let in honest light, organizing the books she had brought into a tidy shelf she constructed from spare planks she found stacked behind the building, and writing a notice that she posted on the door of the general store and nailed to the post outside the livery. School will open Monday next. All children between 6 and 14 years of age are expected. Signed, Miss Augusta Shepard, schoolteacher. She boarded with Mabel Greer, the postmistress, who was a widow of 52 with a sharp tongue and a warm kitchen, and an opinion about everything and everyone in Dry Creek, which she shared freely and without invitation. The ranchers won't send their kids, Mabel told her on the first evening, setting a plate of beans and cornbread in front of Augusta with the authority of someone laying down a court ruling. They need them for the work. The miners neither. And the homesteaders, some of them, their kids have to walk 4 miles each way, and in wet weather that road turns to soup. Then I will go to them, Augusta said. Mabel raised an eyebrow. You will not. That is not how it is done out here. With respect, Augusta said, eating her beans with composure, I intend to discover for myself how things are done out here and decide from there what needs changing. Mabel looked at her for a long moment, and then something shifted in the older woman's expression, something that might have been respect being born. You are either very brave or very foolish, she said. Probably both, Augusta agreed. On Monday, 7 children showed up. By Wednesday, she had 9. By the end of the first month, she had 14, and she had visited every homestead within reasonable riding distance, borrowing Mabel's old bay mare, to speak with parents and explain what schooling could do for their children and what it would cost them, which was nothing but the willingness to let them go for a few hours each day. She loved it. She loved every ink-stained, chalk-dusted, occasionally aggravating moment of it. She loved the way little Clara Hendricks, who was 7, finally understood how letters made sounds and sounds made words and words made sentences, and the way her face opened like a window thrown wide. She loved the way 12-year-old Thomas Avery, who helped his father haul freight and had hands already hardened from work, could do arithmetic in his head faster than Augusta could do it on the board. She loved the chaos and the laughter and the occasional small disaster, like the afternoon a prairie dog found its way in through a gap in the skirting, and terrorized the class for 20 minutes until Augusta managed to usher it back outside with a broom while maintaining, she hoped, some semblance of dignity. It was the 3rd week of September, 1882, when Jacob Thatcher appeared at her door. The morning had started with a thunderstorm that came through fast and hard, the kind that rolled in off the plains without much warning and turned everything wet and brown and confused. It passed by mid-morning, leaving the air smelling of wet grass and the roads turned to thick, clinging mud. Augusta had kept school running through the worst of it, the children delighted by the drama of the rain hammering the roof, and by the time the sun was breaking back through in long, golden slants, she had them settled into their reading, and the room was warm and purposeful and full of the quiet industriousness that she loved most about her work. She heard the boots on the step before the knock came. It was a particular sound, heavy and deliberate, and then a pause, as if the person on the other side of the door was collecting himself, and then 3 firm knocks. "Come in," Augusta called, not looking up from where she was kneeling beside young Clara's desk, helping her sound out a difficult word. The door opened and the mud came in first. That was what she noticed initially, not the man himself but the state of his boots, which were caked thick with the red-brown mud of the post-storm road, and which left clear, honest prints on her newly swept floor as he stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold. Augusta looked up from Clara's reading primer, prepared to deliver a politely firm statement about wiping one's feet, and the words died somewhere between her mind and her mouth. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of lean, rangy build that came from years of hard outdoor work rather than any particular gift of nature. He wore a hat that had seen considerable weather, a canvas duster coat that was dark with rain across the shoulders, and a simple shirt the color of the plains. His face was angular and weathered at the edges, though he was not old, she guessed not yet 30, with dark eyes that were doing something complicated and interesting as they moved from her face to the children and back again. There was a rope scar on the back of his left hand, just visible below his cuff. He held his hat in both hands when he finally took it off, and he stood there looking at her with a directness that she found simultaneously presumptuous and entirely unlike anything she had encountered in the town so far. "Miss Shepard," he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not carry much inflection unless it meant to. "That is correct," she said, straightening from Clara's desk and brushing chalk dust from her skirt with the professional composure she had been carefully building for the past month. "And you are?" "Jacob Thatcher," he said. "I ranch the quarter section north of the Pelham Road. I have a boy, he's 8. His name is Will." Augusta looked past him at the doorway, half expecting a child to materialize, but there was no one. "And where is Will?" she asked. Something passed across Jacob Thatcher's face, not quite discomfort but adjacent to it. "He's at the ranch. I came to ask first before I brought him, whether you'd have him." Augusta studied the man for a moment, genuinely puzzled. "I will have any child who is willing to learn, Mr. Thatcher. That is rather the purpose of a school." "He doesn't talk," Jacob said. "Not since his mother passed 2 years ago. He doesn't make a sound. Hasn't said a word to anyone in 2 years." He paused, and the pause was heavy. "I wanted you to know before you took him on. Some people find it unsettling. Some of the other children might not understand." The room had gone very quiet. Augusta was aware of 14 pairs of young eyes on the exchange, absorbing it with the complete and unfiltered attention that children brought to the emotional business of adults. She looked back at Jacob Thatcher, at the mud on his boots and the careful steadiness in his face, and she understood that it had cost him something to come here and say this plainly. "I have taught children with all manner of difficulties and gifts," she said, and she kept her voice calm and warm and carrying no pity in it because she sensed that pity was not what this man wanted from her. "A child who does not speak is not a child who cannot learn, and his silence is no burden to me. Bring Will on Monday, Mr. Thatcher. He is welcome here." Jacob Thatcher looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly longer than was strictly polite, and she did not look away from it. "Thank you," he said finally, and there was a weight in it that was not quite what a simple thank you usually carried. He turned to go, and then he stopped and looked down at his boots and back at the floor he had tracked across, and something in his expression shifted into a rueful, almost boyish acknowledgement of the mess he had made. He looked up at her. I apologize for the mud. Augusta felt something stir in her chest that she decided to categorize as professional amusement and nothing more complicated than that. Mud washes off, Mr. Thatcher. He nodded once, replaced his hat and left. The children erupted into whispers the moment the door closed, and Augusta brought them back to order with a look and a word. But for the rest of that afternoon, some small portion of her attention kept returning to the man who had arrived at her door with mud on his boots and something in his eyes that she was not yet ready to name. Will Thatcher arrived the following Monday, led by his father's hand to the schoolhouse door, and deposited there with the careful, deliberate hope of a man who was not accustomed to hope costing him much. Will was small for 8, with the same dark eyes as his father and a quality of stillness about him that was different from ordinary shyness. He was not frightened, Augusta decided. He was contained. He had drawn himself down to a very quiet center and stayed there, and the silence was not an absence but a presence, something he carried. She greeted him at the door at his father's level, crouching to meet him directly. She did not speak to Jacob over the boy's head as if Will were furniture. She spoke to Will. "I am glad you came," she said. "My name is Miss Shepard. You may sit wherever you like today, and I will not ask you to speak aloud. You only need to listen and watch, and if you have something to say, you can write it down on your slate." Will looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and after a moment he gave a single small nod. When Augusta looked up, Jacob Thatcher was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, which was unusual because Augusta was generally good at reading expressions. There was something in it beyond gratitude, something older and more uncertain than that. "I will come back for him at 3, Jacob said. "That is fine," Augusta said. "He will be all right." And he was. Will Thatcher settled into the back row of desks with the careful deliberateness of a small animal choosing its burrow. And by the 3rd day, he had moved himself to the middle row. And by the end of the 1st week, he was answering questions on his slate with a speed and accuracy that made Augusta think the stillness outside held a great deal of motion within. He was quick and observant, and had clearly been living his life paying very close attention to everything around him. Jacob came every afternoon at 3 o'clock. That was the first thing she noticed, that he was never late. He arrived precisely when he said he would, sometimes still in his working clothes, sometimes having clearly cleaned up quickly at some point in the afternoon. He always stopped at the door rather than coming in, and Augusta always brought Will to him, and they exchanged a few words, brief and practical, before Jacob took the boy home. She told herself these exchanges were unremarkable. She told herself that on a Thursday in October when Jacob arrived, and Will had written something on his slate that Augusta had carefully preserved, a drawing of a horse that was genuinely talented, and she showed it to Jacob, and the expression that moved across his face at the evidence of his son's engagement with the world was something she would have had to be made of stone not to feel. "He was always drawing before," Jacob said, quietly, turning the slate over in his hands. "Before." He did not elaborate on what before meant, and Augusta did not ask, but they both understood. "He has been copying letters this week as well," Augusta said. "He is picking up the reading quickly." Jacob looked up from the slate. "He's happy here." "I believe so," Augusta said. "He smiles sometimes. He is not a loud child, but I think he is a content one within his own way of being." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "His mother was a teacher," he said. "Back in Tennessee before we came out here. Before." Again that word carrying everything in it that he didn't say. Augusta felt the loss in it, the particular shape of grief that a man carries when something has been taken from a life he built carefully and believed in. "She would be glad he is in school," she said, because it seemed both true and necessary. Jacob handed the slate back to Will, who took it with both hands. Then Jacob looked at Augusta in that direct way of his that she was beginning to learn was simply how he looked at things, with full attention. "Are you getting along all right out here?" he asked. "Dry Creek can be hard on newcomers." "I am managing perfectly well," Augusta said, because it was mostly true. "Mabel Greer's a good woman to board with," he said. She'll look out for you. She has very decided opinions, Augusta said. She does, Jacob agreed, and the edge of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, so brief she nearly missed it. Doesn't make her wrong. He took Will home, and Augusta stood in the doorway watching them go up the road, the tall man and the small boy, and she went inside and spent 20 minutes more time than the papers on her desk required staring at the blackboard without actually seeing it. October deepened toward November, and the mornings grew cold enough that the children arrived at school with rosy cheeks, and she started the stove early. The days shortened. The land went to gold and rust, the big sky over Dry Creek acquiring that peculiar clarity that came with the cold, the kind of sky that made you feel you could see all the way to the edge of things. Jacob Thatcher began arriving a few minutes before 3. She was not sure precisely when this shift occurred, but it was a fact she became aware of, that when she looked toward the window in the last quarter hour of the school day, she would often see him outside, not rushing, not intrusive, simply present and waiting. Sometimes he had a horse with him, other times he had walked from wherever his work had taken him that afternoon. He never came in unless she invited him, which she eventually began to do. "You can wait inside, Mr. Thatcher, it's cold," she said one afternoon in late October, and he came in and sat at the back of the room in one of the adult-sized chairs she had borrowed from Mabel, and he watched the last 15 minutes of her teaching with a quiet, genuine attention that was oddly unnerving. She was reading the class a passage from a book of natural history, about the great prairie and the animals that inhabited it, and she did not stumble or lose her composure. But she was aware of him in the room in a way that was distinct from her awareness of anyone else. When she dismissed the children and they gathered their things and filed out, Will being the last, she found herself turning to Jacob in the emptied room with the late afternoon light slanting golden through the clean windows, and she said, more directly than she had intended, "What did you think of the passage?" He looked genuinely surprised, as if he had not expected to be asked. "I thought it was good," he said. "The part about how the buffalo made the paths that became the rivers, or the rivers followed the paths the buffalo made. I had not thought about it that way." "It is a theory," she said. "The naturalist who wrote it spent 6 years studying the prairie. He believed the animals shaped the land as much as the land shaped the animals." Jacob considered this. "That sounds right," he said. "You look at a cattle trail long enough, it starts to look like it was always there." Augusta found herself genuinely delighted by this observation, by the way his mind moved, practically, from the page to the land he actually lived on. She said, "You have an interesting way of connecting ideas, Mr. Thatcher." He looked at her as if she had said something that mildly startled him. "I don't have a lot of schooling," he said. "My wife was the reader in our house. I got the basics and that was mostly it." "Reading is not what makes a mind interesting," Augusta said. "How you think is what makes it interesting. You can learn the reading any time." There was a moment of quiet, and then Jacob said with that particular careful directness, "I'm not sure I'm followable here, Miss Shepard." "I mean," she said, "that you should not undersell your mind, that is all." He looked at her steadily and then said, "You are different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more afraid of this," he said, and gestured vaguely at the room, at the circumstances, at Dry Creek in general. "I am not particularly afraid of much," Augusta said, which was largely true, though as she said it she was aware of a small, internal acknowledgement that this man, or rather this conversation, was doing something to her composure that was worth paying attention to. He took Will home, and the following week he came inside again without waiting to be asked, and Augusta did not remark on it, and by the second week of November it had become simply the pattern of things, that Jacob Thatcher arrived at 2:45 and waited in the back of the room and listened to the last portion of the school day, and when the children left he and Augusta spent some minutes in conversation before Will finished gathering his things and they went home. She learned him in pieces, the way you learn anything worth knowing. She learned that he had come out from Tennessee 6 years ago with his wife, a leaner, and a plan and some money saved, and had built his ranch from nothing through 4 years of brutal work. She learned that Alina had been funny and fierce, and had insisted on bringing their piano from Tennessee in the wagon, which had been thought absurd by everyone who knew them, and they had done it anyway. She learned that Alina had died of a fever in the brutal winter of 1880, when Will was 6, and that Jacob had been held together since primarily by the ranch, by the work, and by Will, and that these 3 things were sometimes barely enough. She learned that he was a man who said less than he thought, which meant that when he said something, it generally meant exactly what it appeared to mean and sometimes more. She learned that he found animals easier than people generally, but that he was not, when you actually got to know him, in any way inarticulate. He simply had no use for words that weren't doing something. She found this refreshing in a world that seemed to her sometimes very full of words that went nowhere. And Jacob, across those November afternoons, was learning Augusta. He was learning that she had come from a family in San Antonio, her father a schoolteacher before her and her mother, a woman who had opinions about politics that were considered startling for 1882, and which Augusta had apparently inherited. He learned that she had had 2 offers of marriage before coming to Dry Creek, both of which she had declined, not out of coldness, but because she had not yet found a person whose company she preferred to her own solitude, which she described without apology. He learned that she was saving money with the intention of one day having her own school, not a government school but her own, where she could teach the way she believed teaching should work, which was more conversation and less rote repetition. He learned that she had a habit, when she was thinking, of turning a piece of chalk end over end in her fingers, and that when she disagreed with something, she went very still and calm rather than argumentative, which he found, he realized, more compelling than any argument. He brought her firewood. That was the first thing he did outside the schoolhouse context. In late November, after a cold snap that turned the ground iron hard, he appeared at Mabel's door on a Saturday morning with a wagon load of split wood, and when Augusta answered the door in her everyday dress with her hair not yet fully pinned and a book still in her hand, he said, "I had extra cut. Thought you and Mrs. Greer could use it before the real winter comes." Augusta looked at him standing there in the early morning cold with a wagon of firewood that he had cut and stacked and driven to her door, and she felt something warm and complicated settle in her chest. "That is very kind, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Jacob," he said. "You could call me Jacob, if you wanted to." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was thin and clear and very bright, and he was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes that always seemed to be asking and answering something at the same time. "Then you must call me Augusta," she said. "Augusta," he said, as if testing the weight of it. It sounded different when he said it, more there somehow. They stacked the wood together, she and Jacob and Mabel, who supervised from the porch with a cup of coffee and made observations about technique that nobody asked for. And when the wood was stacked, Jacob came in for coffee at Mabel's insistence and sat at the kitchen table and drank it. And Augusta sat across from him, and Mabel pretended to be busy with things in the kitchen, and was transparently not leaving them alone, but was clearly listening to every word with great satisfaction. Dry Creek's winter came in earnest in December. The roads froze, the creek that gave the town its name stopped running and lay locked under ice, and Augusta cut her school days back on the worst mornings to give the children who walked a reasonable chance of arriving without frostbite. She kept the stove burning hot, and the room full of the smell of wood smoke and chalk, and she pushed the children harder through the cold months because there was nothing to do but learn, and she intended to use the time. Jacob came with Will when the road permitted, and on the days when it did not he sent word through another family that Will would not be in today, which was its own careful thoughtfulness. The way he did not simply not appear but made sure she knew why, so she would not worry. She realized she would have worried, and that this fact was telling her something she needed to reckon with. On the Friday before Christmas, she let the children out early and they scattered into the cold afternoon like seeds in the wind, shrieking with the freedom of it. Augusta was putting the room in order when she heard boots on the step, and a moment later Jacob opened the door and looked in, Will at his side, and she said, "You're early." "I know," he said. "I thought if you weren't busy this afternoon, Will wanted to show you something." She looked at Will, who was holding something behind his back with the studied nonchalance of a child concealing a surprise which was not concealment at all. She crouched down to his level. "What is it, Will?" Will brought the thing out from behind his back. It was a drawing, done on good paper rather than a slate, in pencil, detailed and patient, and clearly the work of hours. It was the schoolhouse, drawn from outside, with the windows lit from within and smoke rising from the chimney and figures visible inside through the glass, small but distinct. And in the windows you could make out faces, childlike faces, bent over their work. And at the front, just visible through the largest pane, was a figure at the blackboard, a woman's figure, her hair up, her arm raised to write. Augusta looked at the drawing for a long time. It was remarkable. It was more than remarkable. It was the view from outside of something that mattered, rendered by an 8-year-old boy who could not speak, but who apparently could say everything with a pencil. "Will," she said softly. "This is extraordinary." Will looked at her solemnly and then did something she had not yet seen him do. He smiled. It was a complete, unguarded smile, the kind that a child produces when something is exactly right, and it transformed his small face entirely, and Augusta felt it go straight to some interior place that she had not known had a door. She looked up at Jacob, and Jacob was watching his son's face with an expression of such open, undefended tenderness that Augusta had to look briefly away, not from discomfort, but from the feeling that she was witnessing something very private. "He hasn't smiled like that in 2 years," Jacob said, quietly, so only she could hear. Augusta said nothing. She stood up carefully and held the drawing, and after a moment she said, "I am going to hang this up," and she crossed to the wall beside the door where she had been gradually building a display of the children's best work, and she put Will's drawing there in the center and stepped back, and the three of them looked at it. Jacob said, "Augusta," and then he stopped, as if the thing he intended to say was not yet ready to be said. She turned to look at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, turning it in that way he had, and his eyes when he met hers were doing that complicated thing again, that she had been refusing to name since September. "Merry Christmas," he said finally, which was not what he had been about to say, she was quite certain, but she accepted it for what it was. "Merry Christmas, Jacob," she said, and she meant it with a warmth that surprised even her. Mabel Greer that evening poured herself a cup of tea and set it down and said without preamble, "You are falling in love with Jacob Thatcher." Augusta, correcting papers at the kitchen table, said, "I have no idea what you mean." "You came home from the schoolhouse today with your color up in your mind somewhere else, and his son's drawing is already the first thing you talked about at supper. I have known you 3 months, and you are not a woman who talks about children's drawings at supper unless something else is behind it." Augusta set down her pen. "He is a father looking for support for his son," she said. "We have a professional relationship." "Oh, hogwash," Mabel said, with great tranquility. Augusta returned to her papers and did not say anything further, which Mabel clearly interpreted as confirmation. January came, and the real cold descended, the kind that made the air look white and crackled in the morning. Augusta developed a system of keeping river stones heated on top of the stove and handing them to the children to hold in their laps, which kept them warm and also, she found, helped them concentrate, because there was something about holding something warm and round that was calming. One Thursday in January, Jacob arrived early as he now regularly did, and instead of coming inside, he knocked on the door in a different way than usual, more considered, and when Augusta opened it, he was standing there with something a bit like he had something to say and was working up to the saying of it. "There's a community supper Saturday night at the church hall," he said. "The reverend who passes through puts it on every year. Most of the town goes. I wondered if you would like to go with me and Will." Augusta looked at him and felt the thing in her chest do something quite particular. "Are you asking me to accompany you, Jacob?" she asked. The directness of the question clearly cost him something, but he met it directly, which she had come to understand was what he did. "Yes," he said, "I am." "Then yes," she said, "I would like that." The community supper was in the church hall, which had been decorated with pine boughs and lanterns, and the whole of Dry Creek attended, which meant roughly 60 people in a room built for 40, and the noise and warmth of it was considerable. Jacob arrived at Mabel's door Saturday evening with Will cleaned and buttoned to the collar and his own boots, Augusta noted with private amusement, scrubbed to something approaching spotless. She had put on her best dress, which was a deep green wool that her mother had helped her make before she left San Antonio, and when she came to the door and Jacob saw her, his expression did something that he did not appear to be controlling, an open and immediate response that told her everything she needed to know about what he was feeling, even if he was not yet saying it. "You look very fine," he said, which from Jacob Thatcher carried a great deal more weight than it might have from someone else. "Thank you," she said, "so do you." Will tugged at his father's coat sleeve and signed something, a small, deliberate gesture with his hands that Augusta did not yet know the meaning of, and Jacob said to Will, "I know. Come on, then." "What did he say?" Augusta asked as they walked. "He said you are pretty," Jacob said, looking straight ahead. "I told him I know." Augusta kept her expression composed and her eyes forward and experienced internally a moment of something quite warm and effervescent that she was not sure she had felt before. The supper was good, and the company was lively. Augusta sat between Jacob and old Thomas Avery Sr., who was Thomas the arithmetic prodigy's grandfather, and who had opinions about the school that he wished to share at length. She listened and engaged and laughed at the right moments and kept an awareness, the whole time, of Jacob beside her, the warmth of him, the way he was quiet in the crowd but not uncomfortable, the way Will sat on his other side and ate his supper with great seriousness. Afterward, someone produced a fiddle and a guitar, and the tables were pushed back, and the dancing began. Augusta had not expected dancing and had not prepared for the opinion she was about to form, which was that Jacob Thatcher, rancher and widower and man of very few unnecessary words, was a natural dancer. He was not showy about it. But when he offered her his hand with a question in his eyes and she took it, and they moved into the clearing with the other couples, she discovered that he moved with the same quality of deliberate, unassuming confidence that he brought to everything else, and that dancing with him felt unexpectedly easy, unexpectedly right, the kind of right that was warm and quiet rather than loud. "You dance well," she said, as they turned to the fiddle. "Eleanor taught me," he said. He said it simply, without grief's weight crushing the words, just as a fact, and she understood that this was how he carried his loss now, not by not mentioning her but by being able to speak of her without it undoing him. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Augusta said. "She was," Jacob said. "She would have liked you very much." Augusta looked at him, this honest, steady man, and felt something settle in her that was the opposite of restlessness. She had spent a long time being restless, looking for the life that felt right, riding toward things that had turned out to be wrong turns taken with good intention. This did not feel like a wrong turn. "Jacob," she said. "Augusta," he said. They were both quiet for a moment, dancing in the fiddle's warmth, and she thought that some things did not need to be said immediately, that the right moment was worth waiting for, and this was not the right moment, not quite, not yet. But it was close. Will, it turned out, was also a dancer. He had been taught by his mother. It emerged, and when the children's reel was called, he moved into it with a contained, focused pleasure that made the room smile without him knowing, because he was attending entirely to his feet and his partner, little Clara Hendricks, who was delighted. February brought what Mabel called the thaw that wasn't, a few warm days that suggested spring, and then a hard freeze that made a liar of the suggestion. Augusta extended the school day back to full length and worked the children through their winter reading lists with a thoroughness that produced mild complaints and considerable progress. Jacob began appearing at the school not just at 3 o'clock, but occasionally in the morning, stopping by on his way past from some errand in town, leaving things at the step without necessarily knocking, things like firewood already split to stove length, a jar of preserves with a note from his housekeeper in Will's handwriting, a newspaper from San Antonio that someone had passed through with, that he thought she might like to read. These small things accumulated, and Augusta arranged them in her mind like a collection, each one a thing he had thought of her to do, each one a sentence in a longer declaration he was writing carefully and without rush. On a Tuesday in late February, a situation arose that had been building for some weeks. One of Dry Creek's rougher residents, a man named Doyle who ran a small, perpetually unsuccessful cattle operation and drank steadily to compensate for the unsuccess, had taken it upon himself to decide that the school was filling his sons' heads with ideas above their station and had told them to stop attending. His eldest, Pete, who was 13 and had been one of Augusta's better students, had continued to come anyway, because Pete was 13 and stubborn and had discovered he liked reading and was not prepared to stop. Doyle came to the schoolhouse. He came in the middle of the school day, with enough whiskey in him to have given up caution, and he put his head in the door and announced that Pete was coming home, and what Augusta thought about that was her problem. Augusta was not afraid, but she was aware of 14 children watching to see what she would do, and she understood that this moment was going to define something. She walked to the door and stepped outside, closing it behind her, which removed the audience and gave Pete, who had gone rigid with shame, a degree of privacy. She stood on the step and looked at Doyle, who was larger than her and unpleasant and smelled of whiskey at 10 in the morning, and she said, calmly and clearly, "Mr. Doyle, your son is in the middle of a lesson and I will send him home at 3 as I do every day. If you wish to discuss your concerns about his education, I am available after school hours." Doyle stared at her with bleary hostility. "He doesn't need education, he needs to work." "He will work all his life," Augusta said. "He will be better equipped for that work if he can read and calculate. Now please go home, Mr. Doyle." The authority in her voice, she knew, came partly from sheer nerve and partly from a clear conscience, and partly from the fact that she had dealt with considerably more intimidating things than a drunk man with an opinion. Doyle stared at her for a moment, said something rude that she declined to respond to, and left. She went back inside. 14 children looked at her. She smoothed her skirt and went back to the blackboard and said, "Where were we?" That afternoon Jacob arrived and heard the account from Clara Hendricks, who told it with breathless loyalty, before Augusta could manage the telling herself. Jacob listened to the child and looked at Augusta over Clara's head with an expression that was serious and attentive. When the children had gone, he said, "Doyle's a problem that's been building. Are you all right?" "Perfectly," Augusta said. "You don't have to be perfectly all right," Jacob said. "It was a reasonably unpleasant thing." She looked at him. "I was not frightened," she said. "I was angry, on Pete's behalf. He is a child who wants to learn, and his father would take that from him because of his own bitterness, and that I find enraging." "It is enraging," Jacob agreed, and he said it with a quiet, complete conviction that made her feel genuinely understood. "What can be done about it? I spoke with the mayor last week about the compulsory attendance ordinance that the territory has proposed," Augusta said. "He was not enthusiastic. I intend to be more persuasive." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'll talk to a few of the other ranchers. Some of them have pull with the mayor that I don't, but some of them might be persuaded if the argument is made right." "You would do that?" Augusta asked. He looked at her with that directness that had initially felt presumptuous and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Of course I would," he said. "It matters. The school matters," she said. "You matter," he said, and then he looked briefly at the floor, which was the closest thing to looking away she had ever seen him do, and he added, "The school matters too." Augusta was quiet for a moment that was full. "Jacob," she said. "I know," he said, looking up. "I know this is not the straightforward thing. I know I am a man with a son and a ranch and a history, and that is a complicated thing to bring to someone's door. You have been bringing things to my door for months, she said, and she let the smile through, the one she had been carefully managing for some time. I have not complained. He looked at her and then he laughed, which she had heard him do perhaps twice before and which completely transformed his face, opened it up like a landscape when the clouds move away. No, he said, you have not. I am not a woman who wants an uncomplicated life, Augusta said. I chose to come to Dry Creek, Texas alone at 24 to teach school in a building that was held together partly by ambition and partly by good intentions. I am not in the business of uncomplicated. Jacob stepped toward her just one step, the kind of step that is asking a question. She did not move back. He was close enough that she could see the darker rim around his eyes, the particular quality of attention he brought to looking at her. I have been trying, he said, to find the right way to say this for approximately 3 months. Then perhaps you should stop trying to find the right way and simply say it, Augusta said. I am in love with you, Jacob said, and it came out exactly as simply and exactly as fully as the words suggested. Nothing decorative about it, nothing tentative, just the fact of it, offered plainly. Augusta looked at him, this man who had appeared at her door in September with mud on his boots and something in his eyes that she had refused to name, this quiet, honest, grieved, hopeful, deeply good man, and she felt the whole of the last months rearrange themselves into something she recognized as the shape of her life shifting to accommodate what had always been going to happen. I love you too, she said. I have for some time. I was being careful. I know, he said. I appreciated the care. He took her hand, and they stood in the empty schoolroom in the late February afternoon with the cold pressing at the windows and the stove burning warm and the children's papers stacked on the desk and Will's drawing of the schoolhouse on the wall. And Jacob held her hand with the same careful, deliberate honesty that characterized everything he did. And she held his back with the same, and it was neither dramatic nor quiet but somewhere between the two, which seemed exactly right. He kissed her, gently, briefly, his other hand coming up to her face with a tentativeness that was entirely at odds with his general confidence, and she thought, that is what it looks like when someone is afraid of handling something precious. She kissed him back and let him understand that she was not precious in the sense of fragile. March came in with wind and rain, and Augusta Shepard was in love, which she had not expected to be this year or possibly any year soon, and which she found to be not the disruption she had sometimes imagined, but rather an addition, something that existed alongside everything else without diminishing it. She and Jacob were careful about appearances in Dry Creek, because Augusta understood that her reputation as a teacher depended on the town's regard, and Jacob respected this without being asked. They walked together on Sunday afternoons, which was an established acceptable courtship behavior, and he called on her at Mabel's on Friday evenings, and Mabel sat in the parlor with her sewing and entirely failed to pay attention to anything they said while hearing every word. Will noticed. Will, who noticed everything and said nothing, began looking at Augusta with a different quality of attention, something that had changed in it, something that was perhaps hope of a different kind than the hope he had for his own learning. She noticed and did not rush anything, letting him come to his own sense of it in his own time. In April, something happened that she had not anticipated. Will spoke. He had been in school now for 7 months. He was 9 in March and growing, and his drawings had become extraordinary things that she pinned all over the wall, and his writing was neat and careful, and his arithmetic was something she had stopped teaching him separately because he had surpassed what she could formally instruct, and she was now simply giving him problems to solve for the pleasure of it. He had communicated all of this without a spoken word, through his slate, through his drawings, through gestures and expressions, and Augusta had learned to read him as fluently as she read text. It was a Thursday afternoon and the other children had gone home, and Will was drawing at his desk while Augusta cleaned the board, and it was so quiet that she could hear the wind against the glass and the scratch of his pencil and her own chalk, and into this quiet Will said, "Miss Shepard." His voice, when it came, was rusty with disuse, thin and uncertain, the voice of a boy who had not spoken in nearly 2.5 years, but it was perfectly clear, and it was her name. Augusta stopped. She turned slowly, not abruptly, not with drama, because she understood that drama might close the door again. She looked at Will. He was looking at her with those dark, serious eyes, and his pencil was still, and he said, with great effort and with the look of someone carrying something very heavy to put it down at last, "Thank you." Augusta crossed the room and crouched beside his desk, and she looked at this child who had carried his silence like a coat through the cold of his grief, and she said, "You are so welcome, Will." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked down at his drawing, and she waited, and he said, still without looking up, "Are you going to be my mother?" Augusta felt something happen in her chest that was so large she needed a moment to get control of her face. She said steadily, "I love your father very much, and I love you very much, and whatever our family looks like, it will always include you completely." Will was quiet, processing this. Then he said, "Okay," which was exactly the right word. She had to go and stand at the window for a moment and look at the sky and take several careful breaths before Jacob arrived. When Jacob arrived, Will went to him at the door, and Jacob crouched down, and Will said, "Papa." Jacob went absolutely still. Augusta, watching from across the room, saw the complete cessation of everything in him as the word landed, and then she watched him put his arms around his son and hold on, and she turned back to the window because some moments are too large to witness entirely. She heard Jacob's voice, muffled and rough, saying, "Hey, buddy. Hey," just that. Jacob did not say much to Augusta that afternoon. He stood in the room with Will at his side, and he looked at her with eyes that were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with feeling too many things at once, and he said, "Augusta." "I know," she said. "I don't have words for this," he said. "I know that too." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead just that, with his hat in his hand, and Will watched this transaction with the serious, analytical attention of a child taking an inventory of the world, and then went back to his drawing. Jacob proposed to Augusta in May. He did it in the schoolhouse, which she later thought was perhaps not surprising, as the schoolhouse was the beginning of everything, the door she had been standing behind when their story started. He came on a Saturday morning when there was no school, and she was there doing her weekly cleaning and preparation, and he knocked 3 times the way he always did and came in. He was not particularly formal about it, which was entirely consistent with who he was. He stood in the middle of the room and said, "Augusta, I would like to marry you if you are willing. I have a son and a ranch and a piano that belong to a leaner that I believe you will appreciate, and I have loved you since approximately the second time I talked to you, and I intend to love you for the rest of my life. I have a ring." He produced it, a simple gold band with a small inset stone, which he had apparently had in his pocket for some time, judging by how readily it appeared. "I had it made in San Antonio. I had your friend Margaret Avery find out your size without telling you." Augusta looked at the ring and looked at the man holding it and felt the whole complicated, wonderful, clear thing that had been building in her for 8 months come to its natural resting place. "Yes," she said, "I am absolutely willing." He put the ring on her finger, and she kissed him properly this time, not the careful, tentative things they had managed in the months of being appropriately restrained, but with the full force of all the feeling she had been holding with such deliberate composure, and Jacob responded in kind with everything he had been similarly containing, and the schoolhouse witnessed it in its honest, quiet way, and the morning light through the clean windows was very bright and warm. They were married in July 1883, on a bright, dry day that Mabel Greer declared perfect weather for a wedding and a good sign for the future, both of which she delivered as established facts rather than opinions. The ceremony was held in the church, which had acquired a new minister by spring, a cheerful young man from Kansas City named Reverend Ellis, who was enthusiastic about everything, and who performed the ceremony with evident pleasure. Augusta wore a dress of ivory cotton that her mother had sent from San Antonio, having made the trip out for the wedding along with Augusta's father, who shook Jacob's hand for a long time and looked at him with the particular scrutiny of a father who loves his daughter and wishes to determine if the man before him is worthy. Jacob met the scrutiny calmly and steadily, which was how he met everything, and Augusta's father, whose name was David, and who was a schoolteacher himself and therefore had high standards, told Jacob afterward that he would do very well. Will stood beside his father in a suit that Jacob had made in Abilene, and when the Reverend asked if anyone present objected to the union, Will, with the new and growing ease of his returned voice, said very quietly and very seriously to the child beside him, Clara Hendricks, "I hope nobody objects." Clara said she didn't think anyone would. She was right. Augusta kept the school. This was never in question, had never been proposed to be otherwise, and Jacob had not only not objected, but had given the school its first proper repair that summer, replacing the broken skirting that had let in the prairie dog, mending the windows, and building her 2 new shelves for books. He did these things on 3 separate Saturdays, with Will handing him tools with the serious industry of a child who considers himself essential to the project. They moved Augusta's things into Jacob's ranch house, which was a good house, solidly built, with a kitchen large enough and a proper parlor, and as Jacob had promised, a piano, which stood against the east wall of the parlor, and which Augusta sat down at the evening. She arrived and played for 20 minutes while Jacob stood in the doorway and Will sat on the floor beside the instrument and listened with closed eyes. The piano had been a Leaner's, and Augusta played it with gratitude and without guilt, because Jacob had made clear, in his uncomplicated way, that he did not want the world that had been put away but the world that was continuing, and the piano was part of the continuing. Life at the ranch suited Augusta in ways she had not anticipated. She had grown up in a town and loved the intellectual energy of it, but the ranch offered something different and equally valuable, a particular quality of space and quiet that was new to her, the kind of space in which she found that her thinking went somewhere it didn't always go in a crowded place. She wrote in the mornings before school, letters to educational colleagues, a proposal she had been formulating for the territory regarding compulsory attendance, her own observations about teaching that she was increasingly convinced should become something organized. Jacob found her writing one morning at the kitchen table before dawn and asked what she was working on, and she explained, and he listened with the quality of attention he gave everything she said, which still, months into their marriage, moved her in a way she had not become accustomed to. He said, "You should write that up properly and send it to the territorial superintendent. I know someone who knows him." She stared at him. "Do you really?" "I know several people," he said, with mild offense which made her laugh. He did know someone, and the letter went, and the superintendent wrote back in November, which was gratifying, and Augusta began a correspondence that would eventually matter a great deal, but that is getting ahead of things. The autumn of 1883 was a good one. The school had 18 students by October. The attendance ordinance that Augusta and Jacob and several allied ranchers had pushed for had passed in September. And Pete Doyle, who was now 14 and close to aging out of schooling, had taken to reading with such passion that Augusta had started lending him books from her own collection and was quietly planning to write a letter to a college in Austin on his behalf. Doyle Sr. remained unhappy, but was no longer a practical obstacle, partly because the ordinance had teeth now, partly because Pete had grown large and capable enough to hold his own ground, and partly because Pete's mother, a quiet woman named Ruth who had watched the whole situation with careful eyes, had told her husband that she would leave him if he interfered again, and meant it. Jacob watched Augusta handle all of this, the political maneuvering, the parent management, the daily work of the school, and the evenings at home, and he said to her one November evening, sitting by the fire after Will had gone to bed. "I don't think I understand how you do it. Any particular piece of it I can follow. All of it together I lose track of." "You run a ranch," Augusta said. "You do 40 things at once and you make it look like there is only one thing." "That's different," he said. "I know ranch work. I know it so well I don't have to think about most of it. You're doing things you have to invent as you go. Isn't that what you did when you built the ranch?" He considered this. "I suppose so." "Then we are not so different," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had developed the habit of doing when they sat together, not with any announcement, just a casual, complete claiming of her hand that she had come to love as much as any more dramatic gesture. "You are remarkable," he said. "I know," she said, and he laughed. She was expecting a child by December, which she discovered with a mixture of joy and what she could only describe as wonder, given that she had not previously spent much time thinking about motherhood as something imminent. She told Jacob on a December evening directly because that was how she handled things, and Jacob was very still for a moment and then pulled her close with something that was not his usual deliberate care but something more urgent, more unguarded. "Are you happy?" he asked, his chin at her hair. "Thoroughly," she said. "Good," he said. "Good." He held on a moment longer, and she could feel the fullness in him, the particular quality of a man for whom the world has given back something he was not sure it would give again. They told Will at breakfast. Will received the information with his characteristic seriousness, digesting it for several minutes while eating his porridge, and then looked up and said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know until they arrive," Augusta told him. Will thought about this. "I would prefer a brother," he said, "but a sister would be acceptable." "We'll pass that along," Jacob said gravely. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was mild by Dry Creek standards, which meant merely cold rather than punishing, and Augusta taught through it with full energy until March, when Mabel Greer insisted on taking over the school 3 days a week for the last month of Augusta's term, having declared herself fully qualified to mind children, as she had done so during the previous 2 teachers' tenures and nobody had expired. Augusta's son was born in April 1884, a vigorous, loud, very present boy who arrived on an evening when the windows were open to the first real warmth of spring, and the prairie outside was beginning to show its new green. They named him Thomas James Thatcher, Thomas for Augusta's father and James for Jacob's, and he was from the first moment so completely himself that Augusta felt she had always known him. Will, when he met his brother for the first time, sat beside Augusta's bed and looked at Thomas with an expression of concentrated assessment that lasted several minutes. Then he said, "He is quite small." "He will get bigger," Augusta said. "I know," Will said. "I was small too, Papa told me." He paused, and then he reached out and very carefully touched Thomas's fist, which opened and closed around Will's finger with the reflexive strength of the newly arrived. And Will's face did the thing it had done the day he smiled for the first time in the schoolhouse, opened completely, every careful guard gone. "Hello," he said to his brother quietly. "I am Will. I am your brother." Thomas, who was 3 days old and not yet in a position to respond, waved his fist. Jacob stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched his 2 sons, and then looked at his wife, and Augusta looked back at him, and everything between them in that look was full and finished and completely right. Pete Doyle did go to Austin. The letter that Augusta wrote on his behalf, to a professor of her acquaintance at the University of Texas, who was connected to a recently established college for promising students of working families, resulted in a placement and a modest scholarship, and Pete Doyle left Dry Creek in September 1884 at the age of 15, which was young but not unprecedented, to the astonishment of nearly everyone and the particular, private pride of Augusta, who told no one how much she had worked behind the scenes for it. His mother, Ruth, came to the schoolhouse before he left and sat with Augusta, and wept with relief and gratitude and something that was simply a mother seeing the world open in front of her child, and Augusta held her hand and understood it completely. The school continued to grow. By 1885, Augusta had 22 students, which was too many for one room and one teacher, and she petitioned the town council for a second teacher and a second room. The council was reluctant, as town councils generally were about spending money, but Jacob had by this point become a man of some standing in the community, having bought additional land and expanded his operation, and his voice in the council chamber carried weight. He used it with Augusta's full approval and also with her coaching, because she had written the argument he made largely herself. They got the second room. The new teacher came in September 1885, a young woman from Kansas named Helen Cross, who was 22, and had all the enthusiasm of the newly graduated, and most of the good sense she would eventually develop fully. Augusta took her under her wing with the same warmth and firmness she applied to everything she cared about. By the autumn of 1885, Dry Creek had its school properly established, its attendance ordinance enforced, and its second teacher in place, and Augusta Shepard Thatcher had accomplished in 3 years what she had come here to do, and was in the process of deciding what to do next, which was very like her. The ranch was flourishing. Jacob had added horses to his cattle, breeding a line of working horses that had a reputation in the territory for quality, which was labor that Will, now 12, was deeply invested in, having discovered that his mother's gift for drawing was matched by an almost supernatural ability to understand horses. Will had, in the years since the autumn he had found his voice, become a young person of such quiet, specific capability that he astonished new acquaintances on a regular basis. He talked now with ease, not volubly, not the way some people talk, but with precision and intention, and Augusta had learned that this was simply his nature, that he had not been damaged into silence but had retreated there, and that the self who had come back was complete. Jacob had not stopped coming to the schoolhouse. He stopped by not every day now, not with the regularity of those early months when he had been bringing Will, and she understood now, finding reasons to linger, but often enough, sometimes just to sit in the back while she finished something, sometimes to bring lunch in the winter when the road between the ranch and the school was long in the cold. The children knew him and accepted him with the cheerful indifference of children who have categorized a presence as safe and useful, and he helped them sometimes with arithmetic, having gotten considerably better at it in the years of Augusta's influence, and with questions about animals and ranching and the natural world, which he knew with the particular authority of someone who had lived in it for a long time. He never stopped arriving with the mud sometimes on his boots, because that was the honest truth of his life, the outdoor life, the working life, and Augusta had never minded it and never would, because the mud on his boots had been the first thing she ever noticed about him, and she had fallen in love with everything that came after. In 1886, Thomas was 2 years old and walking with great determination and absolutely no caution whatsoever, a combination that kept Augusta and Jacob in a constant state of alert that was also, they agreed privately, one of the funniest things they had ever experienced. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin and Will's precise way of examining things, so concentrated in one small person that the result was extraordinary to watch. Augusta was writing again, in the serious and systematic way, a long document about teaching methodology that grew through the summer and fall of 1886 into something she began to think of as a book rather than a letter. She showed it to Jacob one evening, the whole of it, which by then was 60 handwritten pages, and he read it over 3 evenings, which was itself a kind of testament, because Jacob was not a man who made himself sit still for 60 pages of anything except perhaps a good novel. "This is good," he said on the 3rd evening, setting it down. "This is genuinely good. You should try to have it published." "I have been thinking about that," she said. "Someone in Austin would know who to approach," he said. "I can write to Professor Harrison's colleague, or you can write directly, which will probably work better." "It will probably work better," she agreed, and he smiled. The book was accepted by a small educational publisher in Austin in the spring of 1887, which was a thing that Augusta handled with composure in public and with considerable, unguarded joy in the privacy of the kitchen at home, where she permitted herself to be happy about it in all the ways she pleased. And Jacob took both her hands and swung her around in a circle in the kitchen like they were dancing at the church hall, which Thomas, sitting on the floor eating a biscuit, found hilarious. Will was 13 and becoming seriously impressive. He was tall now, going to be his father's height, and he had Jacob's quality of stillness and self-possession and Augusta's quickness of mind, and he was developing a side-by-side interest in horses and books that seemed to everyone who knew him perfectly fitting for who he was. He had a friend, the son of a neighboring rancher, a boy named Aaron whose family had homesteaded east of the Pelham Road, and the two of them were inseparable in the way of boys who have found their particular matching person, and Augusta watched this friendship with the particular pleasure of a teacher who has seen the world work as it ought. The summer of 1887 was long and golden. The land around Dry Creek was green from a good spring rain, and the cattle were doing well, and the horses were doing better, and Thomas had learned to ride a small, ancient, profoundly patient pony named Biscuit without falling off more than twice a day, which Jacob declared excellent progress. One evening in August that summer, the whole family sat on the porch in the blue dusk, which was the kind of August evening that Texas does occasionally and does beautifully. The heat softened to something bearable, and the sky gone to colors that were almost too deliberate, too composed, as if something had arranged them. Thomas was asleep against Augusta's shoulder, which he did regularly and which she loved, the weight of him and the warmth of him and the complete trusting abandonment of it. Will was reading, as he nearly always was in the evenings, sitting on the step with a book tilted to catch the last light. Jacob sat beside Augusta in the other chair, his knee touching hers, which was as much as the public-facing evening required and as much as she needed. She was thinking about nothing in particular, or rather about everything, the pleasant, settled kind of everything where the pieces of your life are all present and nothing is pressing, and you can simply be where you are. Jacob said quietly so as not to wake Thomas, "Are you content?" She looked at him, at the man she had learned over the years in all his particulars, the way he drank his coffee, the way he talked to his horses, the way he read slowly and thought carefully and never said a thing he didn't mean, the way he loved his children with a fullness that expressed itself mostly in presence, in the simple, reliable fact of being there every day without fail. She thought about the schoolhouse in September 1882, the mud on his boots, the careful hope in his eyes, the way he had stood at her door and trusted her with the most delicate thing he had, his son, and by that act had inadvertently trusted her with himself. "I am more than content," she said. "I have a school and a book and you and two extraordinary children and Mabel Greer's opinion of everything, and the largest sky I have ever seen in my life. What else would there be to want?" "Another child, maybe," Jacob said, and his voice when he said it was quiet and a little careful, offering rather than asking. Augusta looked at him. "Are you asking or suggesting?" "I am raising the topic," he said, "for discussion." "I had been thinking about it," she said. "I find that I would like another if you would." "I would very much," he said. Will looked up from his book. "I would prefer it be a girl this time," he said without preamble, which meant he had been listening from his step with the same selective attention he applied to everything. "It would be good for Thomas to have a sister." "We will keep that in mind," Jacob said gravely. Thomas, asleep against Augusta's shoulder, produced a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a dream about his pony. Augusta pressed her cheek briefly to the top of his head, and felt the rightness of it all settle through her like warmth settling through a room when you've got the stove going properly. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1888, on a morning when the redbuds were in bloom along the creek, and the air smelled of rain and new grass. She was a quiet, watchful infant with her father's dark eyes, and a quality, even in her first days of looking at the world with a particular, undisturbed attention. They named her Alina Rose Thatcher, Alina for Will's mother and Rose for Augusta's grandmother, and Will, 14 and very nearly tall as his father, held her with extraordinary concentrated care and said to her, with the same serious gravity he had said hello to Thomas with 4 years prior, "Hello. I am Will, your brother. Thomas is your other brother. He is 4 and you will need to be patient with him." Thomas, who was indeed 4, came and pressed his nose against his sister's nose with great seriousness, and then looked up at his mother and said, "She smells nice." Jacob stood at the window in the morning light, and Augusta watched him watching his children with his daughter in his arms, and she thought about all the things that had not been certain, all the turns in the road that could have gone differently, and she felt gratitude of a very specific and honest kind, not the vague gratitude of things generally being all right, but the precise gratitude of knowing exactly what you are glad of and why. She recovered her strength through the spring, with Mabel, who was now 65 and showing no signs of slowing, coming out to the ranch regularly to help and to provide her opinions on infant management, which Augusta accepted with the fond tolerance that years of Mabel had developed in her. She went back to the school in September, with Alina in a cradle in the corner that Jacob had built and positioned near the stove, and the children, delighted, took turns on assigned intervals to check on the baby, which Augusta had decided was both practical and educational, specifically in the matter of responsibility. It worked better than she had expected. Clara Hendricks, who was now 13 and one of Augusta's most capable older students, appointed herself unofficial supervisor of the baby rotation with an authority that Augusta found, privately, extremely funny. The autumn of 1888 was the beginning of something that had been growing in Augusta's mind for some time, what she called, in her own thinking, the project, which was a more formal school, a real one, with dedicated rooms and a proper library and a teacher training program for the women, particularly the younger women in and around Dry Creek, who had the capability and the inclination to teach. She laid it out for Jacob on a series of evenings that fall with her notes spread on the kitchen table and Alina in her lap, and Jacob listened in the way he listened to things he knew mattered, with his full mind rather than just his ears. "This will require money," he said. "It will," she said. "I've had a good year," he said, "and the year before was good. I want to put something toward it." She looked at him. "Jacob, this is your family's money, the ranch." "You are my family," he said. "This is something you're going to build that will matter to people for 50 years. That's worth putting money toward." She held his gaze for a long moment, this stubborn, generous man. "There will need to be other investors," she said. "The town council should fund a portion, perhaps the territory." "Right, the territory," he said. "I'll talk to the council. Between the two of us, I think we can make this happen." "Between the two of us," she said, "I believe we can make nearly anything happen." He smiled at her across the kitchen table, across the scattered papers and the lamp and Alina asleep in her arms, and it was the same smile she had first seen at the church hall, the one that opened him up completely. And she thought, this is the life, exactly this. The working and the building and the love and the ordinary evenings and the particular person across the table who has seen all of you and stayed and built and stayed some more. The school, the proper one, the Augusta Shepard Academy of Education, which was what the town council somewhat grandly named it over Augusta's mild objection that her name on the building was unnecessary, opened in September 1890. It was a 2-story building with 4 classrooms and a library that contained 300 books, many of them Augusta's own, and a small apartment for a resident teacher on the 2nd floor. It cost more than had been budgeted and somewhat less than had been feared, and Augusta had spent 18 months on its planning, funding, staffing, and construction without stopping the regular school for a single day. The day it opened, she stood at the door in the morning before anyone arrived, and the September sun was coming in exactly the way it had come into the old schoolhouse 8 years before when she had first cleaned those windows and let in honest light, and she thought about all of it from the beginning, the stagecoach, the bruise-colored sky, the dusty town, the small schoolhouse that had needed so much. The 14 children who had become 22 who had become more. Pete Doyle, who had written to her from Austin where he had graduated and was now teaching himself. Clara Hendricks, who was 21 and enrolled in the Academy's teacher training program. Thomas Avery, who had become an engineer and worked for the railroad. Will, who was 16 and would be the best horseman in the territory before he was 20, and who read everything and thought carefully and spoke precisely and was going to be, Augusta knew, something very fine. She heard boots on the step. She turned, and it was Jacob, as it had been Jacob before, arriving at her door with mud on his boots because he had walked from where he'd been working that morning, and the grass was wet with dew, and the path was soft. He had a cup of coffee in each hand, and he offered one to her without a word, and she took it. He stood beside her in the doorway of the school she had built, with the morning light coming in and the smell of new wood and old books and chalk that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life as the smell of her work, her purpose, the thing she had come here to do and done. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "It is a good school," he said. "It is a very good school," she said. They stood there together in the doorway, this man and this woman who had built their life the way you build anything worth having, with patience and honesty and the willingness to keep working even when it was hard. And the town of Dry Creek was waking up around them, the general store opening, the livery's doors swinging wide, the sound of children coming up the road, their voices carrying in the clear September air, and it was exactly right. Jacob looked down at his boots with mild exasperation at the mud. "I walked through the low grass," he said. "You have been tracking mud into my school for 8 years, Augusta said, and she could not keep the warmth out of it, not even if she had wanted to. I would not have it any other way." He looked at her, and there it was, that thing in his eyes, the same thing that had been there on the September morning in 1882 when he had come to her door for the first time, except now she had a name for it that had nothing uncertain about it. Love, unambiguous and complete, the kind that had been built between two people who had chosen each other knowing exactly what they were choosing, and had found the choosing more than worth it every single day since. "Augusta," he said. "Jacob," she said. The children came up the road, their voices bright with the particular energy of a new school year. And inside the building Clara Hendricks was arranging books on the library shelves. And somewhere on the property, Thomas was explaining to his younger sister, Alina, the precise rules of a game he had invented. And Will was at the ranch with his horses and his books. And Mabel Greer was at her door on the main street watching the children pass and offering commentary to no one in particular. Augusta and Jacob stood together in the doorway of the school they had helped build, and the life they had helped make, and let the morning come to them. And it was good, and it was whole, and it was theirs. "The mud on his boots," she had once said, "washes off. What remained was everything else, the honest, enduring, daily fact of a love that had started at a schoolhouse door and grown, season by season, into something as sturdy and as necessary as the land itself. And that was enough. That was, in every particular way that mattered, exactly enough."